got to consider, which is who is going to be your storyteller? Who is going to be your narrator? That is your point of view. Every single story has a point of view because it has a narrator. So the point of view is the position from which the story is told. There are 3 points of view that you can use. The first person, the third person omniscient, and the third person limited. The first person point of view is told from the viewpoint of one of the characters in the story. The character in the story explains all the events through his or her eyes, using the pronouns I or me. Now, the first person point of view has a very strong advantage. It gives the story an immediacy and a freshness because you're seeing it through the character's eyes as it unfolds. The downside of the first person point of view is that as a reader, you know only what that character, that storyteller, knows. So if the storyteller doesn't tell you, because the storyteller doesn't see it, you don't know it. Third person omniscient. Omniscient means all-knowing. Omni is all. That narrator is almost like a puppet master or marionette master standing above the action and looking down into every single character, into their brains. So the omniscient third-person narrator sees everything and tells you everything. You can identify that not only by what you know, but also by those pronouns. And you'll have the third-person pronouns she, he, and they. The third person limited is when the narrator tells the story through the eyes of only one character using the pronouns she, he, and they. Most stories, not all, most stories are first person or third person omniscient. The third person limited isn't used as often. What I'd like you to do now is to read the paragraphs in your study guide and identify the point of view for each one. Underline all the pronouns that you used to help you identify the point of view. Then come back. First one, the personal history and experience of David Copperfield the Younger, Chapter 1, I Am Born. Now, in this one, I'm sure that you found those first-person pronouns, I, and you used those to identify the fact that this is in the first person. As I read it, listen for the I's. Whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show. To begin my life with the beginning of my life, I record that I was born, as I have been informed and believe, on a Friday at 12 o'clock at night. It was remarked that the clock began to strike and I began to cry simultaneously. Now we can tell it's first person because David Copperfield is telling it using the I from his own viewpoint. The advantage of this is that we identify with David Copperfield and we get to know him and we feel like he's almost a friend. The disadvantage of the first person is we don't know anything else about anything that David Copperfield doesn't know. Second one, Old Berman was a painter who lived on the ground floor beneath them. He was past 60 and had a Michelangelo's Moses beard. Berman was a failure in art. He had been always about to paint a masterpiece, but had never yet begun it. For several years, he had painted nothing except now and then a dab in the line of commerce or advertising. He earned a little by serving as a model to those young artists in the colony. I'm sure that you recognize this as third-person omniscient because of the pronouns he, and also because the author is standing almost above the action, looking down. The author knows everything about this old artist's life. He knows how he looks, He knows that he's just about to paint something. He knows that he'd never yet begun it. He knows how he's earned a living. So he knows all. He is omniscient. And the last example is the third person limited. We see it through Gregor's eyes. One morning, as Gregor Samsa was waking up from anxious dreams, he discovered that in bed he had been changed into a monstrous, verminous bug. He lay on his armor-hard back and saw, as he lifted his head up a little, his brown, arched abdomen divided up into rigid bow-like sections. From this height, the blanket, just about ready to slide off completely, could hardly stay in place. His numerous legs, pitifully thin in comparison to the rest of his circumference, flickered helplessly before his eyes. Not using the eye, so we know it's not first person, but we see only what Gregor is seeing. So this is the third person limited. Now, let's have some fun with point of view. In this exercise, you're going to rewrite each of the paragraphs from the previous exercise into a different point of view. When you're finished, please come back. Start by rewriting the David Copperfield, which was in the first person, into the omniscient point of view. Well, the first thing I know that I have to do is I've got to change those pronouns from the first person pronouns to the third person. So here's how I revised it. Whether David Copperfield shall turn out to be the hero of his own life, or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show. To begin his life, with the beginning of his life, David records that he was born, as he has been informed and believed, on a Friday at 12 o'clock at night. It was remarked that the clock began to strike and the baby began to cry simultaneously. So now I'm not looking at events through David Copperfield's eyes. I'm looking at events from above and seeing all. Now I'd like you to rewrite the O. Henry story into the first person point of view. The first thing I've got to do is I've got to change those pronouns. So I'm going to use the first person pronouns. I was a painter who lived on the ground floor beneath them. I was past 60 and had a Michelangelo's Moses beard. I was a failure in art. I had been always about to paint a masterpiece, but had never yet begun it. For several years, I had painted nothing except now and then a dab in the line of commerce or advertising. I earned a little by serving as a model to those young artists in the colony. So now I'm seeing events only through the man's eyes. One last time. Let's rewrite the Franz Kafka from the third person limited into the first person point of view. One morning, as I was waking up from anxious dreams, I discovered that in bed I had been changed into a monstrous, verminous bug. I lay on my armor-hard back and saw, as I lifted my head up a little, my brown, arched abdomen divided up into rigid, bow-like sections. From this height, the blanket, just about ready to slide off completely, could hardly stay in place. My numerous legs, pitifully thin in comparison to the rest of my circumference, flickered helplessly before my eyes. So now I'm using the I and the my, first person. Many artists have played around with point of view as they create their literature. a lot of people find that changing point of view unlocks their creativity. For example, Laura Ingalls Wilder originally wrote her Little House on the Prairie books from the first person point of view, using the I, me, and mine. She found that didn't work for her because it didn't allow her the distance that she needed to view events objectively. So she changed it to the omniscient point of view. And that worked very effectively. Other creative writers take an entirely different slant on point of view. So rather than changing perhaps from the first to the third, what they do is they look through some other character's eyes. For example, Beowulf, an omniscient story about a monster, has been retold from the monster's first-person point of view in a modern novel called Grendel. Jane Eyre, the story of a poor governess, one creative writer took that story and looked through the eyes of Jane's husband's first wife. So you can not only switch point of view, but you can switch the character that you're using to tell the story. Now let's take a look at conflict. Conflict in fiction is a struggle or a fight, but not necessarily a violent fight. Conflict keeps readers interested, compelling them to read on to find out how it ends. You want a conflict because you want to give your readers some reason to feel suspense. There are two kinds of conflict. There's external conflict and there's internal conflict. External conflict, the characters struggle against a force outside of themselves. Usually it's another person, but it can also be an animal or it can be nature. In the internal conflict, the characters battle a force within themselves. They might battle something with their conscience, for example. They don't know which way to act. Most short stories contain both external and internal conflict, but usually one is more dominant. Now remember, a short story is short. As we said, it should be read in about an hour and a half. It's usually 2,000 to 7,000 words. So you're not going to be able to develop many conflicts. So usually you'll have one primary conflict. What I'd like you to do is I would like you to identify the conflict in each of the paragraphs printed in your study guide. Then come back. This particular conflict comes from a short story called To Build a Fire by Jack London. Well, the man in this story is obviously freezing, and he's going to be freezing to death. You can tell that because he's so cold, and he can't keep on pumping blood. His extremities are starting to freeze. The man is having an external conflict with nature. Another example. Well, you can tell that this man is incredibly upset.